Welcome to the Grapevine Harvest. I'm your host, Dan Ketting, and today well, it's exciting because this is an old friend of mine. She's not old, we're just old friends.
We're old.
We're old. And Gayle Ross from Texas, one of the finest storytellers you're going to find anywhere in the country. Gayle is a premier storyteller. And Gayle is, she's dear to my heart because she's one of the first storytellers that I worked with and that encouraged me to continue telling stories. So I want to welcome Gayle Ross. Hi, Gayle.
Hi, Dan.
How you doing, kid?
I'm doing pretty good. It was a good flight.
Oh, it was good.
Yeah, took off, landed, just like it was supposed to.
I used to always worry about that. George Carlin once had that routine about flying, and he says non-stop flights, that word worried him, because he liked to stop once in a while.
At some point, you want to come down.
I want to come down.
I saw his whole routine one time on the stewardesses' little instructional thing they give you. I've always thought those were absurd anyway. You know, who's going to, when that mask comes down, are you going to breathe normally? You know, are you going to be able to?
You're hyperventilating.
No. No, it's good to be here.
Yeah. Well, you're going to be working here in Springfield, doing schools and doing a concert for Prairie Grapevine. And what I wanted to talk to you today about was your tradition in storytelling, and maybe you can give us a few examples of those traditions and talk about why you got into storytelling, how you got into it, and also what your feelings are and the representation of you as really what I consider as an ambassador for your culture.
Well, I like to hope that's what I'm doing. I'm Cherokee. My great-great-great-grandfather, as you know, was Principal John Ross, Principal Chief John Ross of the Cherokee Nation. So we have a lot of family history that were the stories that I heard growing up. My grandmother was a storyteller. But mostly even though she told stories, at one point she had her own radio show in Denver telling Native American stories on the radio. The stories that we heard at home had to do with the history and who the old chief was and about the Trail of Tears when we were moved from our homeland to Oklahoma. And that was just a very important influence on my life when I was a child. I don't remember when I started telling stories. I really don't. If you ask my mother, she will tell you she's always been that way. You know, that's her way of looking at it. But I can remember long car trips. I can remember telling my brothers and sisters, you know, why the North Star stands still or why Possum's tail is ugly. And so it must have been pretty young when I started. After I got out of school and started into college, I majored in radio, television, film.
Oh.
Because that's where you went, I think, if you were... I didn't think of it as storytelling, although I can look back at it and see how it was wonderful training for what came later. I worked in radio. I told news stories on the radio. I wrote commercials. Gosh, my karma is destroyed. For television. And was just kind of a media bum. You know, traveled around from market to market, adding call letters to my name. And then in 1978, Elizabeth Ellis took me to Jonesboro. She'd been talking about her traditional Jack stories and Kentucky stories she grew up with as opposed to the traditional Cherokee stories that I knew, and what a wonderful blend she thought they would make. She wanted me to join her and perform as a duo, and I was like, well, these are just stories I tell at parties and campfires and things like that. So she took me to Jonesboro, which, as you know, will open your eyes in a big hurry. This is the National Storytelling Festival, and I heard other people telling stories, and we told at the swapping ground, and we got a lot of support and encouragement. And on the way home, basically, we said, I will if you will.
That's great.
So, but over the years, you know, we were a duo for 3 years, and that was wonderful training. But I think for each of us, our own personal goals, our own mission from God, as the Blues Brothers would say, kind of began taking over our telling more and more, and we began to go our separate ways, although we're still very dear friends and we tell as a duo when we can. But on my own as a storyteller, say over the past 12 years, helping people understand about Indian culture as it is now, not just something frozen in the past, is a big part of why I do what I do.
Do you find that your audiences that are of non-Indian heritage, do they come up to you and say, gosh, I didn't know that, or, oh, I can't believe that's true, or...
Hundreds of times.
Hundreds of times.
Millions of times, actually. You know, it's, a lot of people know a lot about pottery, painting, jewelry making, basketry, rugs. The Indian craftsperson, there's an accepted mechanism for and a system whereby artists and craftspeople make a very good living and are well known in their fields. But what people don't know about, I think, is that there are really fine Indian performing artists. And I've worked with most of them. I've had the good fortune traveling around to meet and work with most of them. Bill Miller, the incredibly talented singer-songwriter. Stockbridge Muncie, originally from Wisconsin, lives in Nashville. Joanne Shenandoah, the wonderfully talented Oneida woman. Floyd Westerman.
Oh, I worked with Floyd.
Yeah, Floyd Westerman. The old Chief Tin Bears in Dances with Wolves is a really good singer-songwriter. When we all get together, like at a festival, like this one in Texas that I do called Festival of the Eagle, which is all Indian performing artists, we often make rather wicked jokes about some of the questions that people will come up and ask. I'm amazed at how long we've all been occupying this same space and how little people really know. Bill Miller says his favorite dumb question is, did you make your own beaded earrings? And he always says, well, do you go up to every Oriental person and ask them if they made that Toyota they're driving? But the level of understanding has a long way to go.
I think it's true. I was reading some articles that were in the Chicago Tribune just this past week about the Native American movement with the sports figures and the teams. And to be really honest, I've always thought that any time you take any nationality and you put them you make them a sports team, what you've done is you've denigrated them, whether it's the Cleveland Indians or whether it's the Fighting Irish of Notre Dame, you've denigrated them to a mascot. And nobody should be a mascot.
You've made them a caricature, a cartoon,
Right.
which is a one-dimensional image,
Right.
which is the essence of stereotyping.
Right.
You know, the essence of stereotyping. Stereotypes begin when somebody takes one common characteristic that may indeed be very prevalent throughout a given group, cultural, ethnic, religious, or otherwise. But when you take that one tiny little characteristic and define the entire being of a person by that one characteristic, whether it can be applied fairly or not, then you're denying somebody's humanity. You're denying them that rich, complex, varied set of characteristics and aspects that make up human beings.
Right.
So anytime you can deny somebody's humanity, then you have placed them in, in a position of being objects.
Right.
Which is
Exactly.
which is basically what is so evil about stereotyping. You'll find lots of different points of view in the Indian community on that. You'll find people who are not bothered one way or another by it, to people who take it as a larger issue, take it very seriously. I, for one, can't stand the Washington Redskins, but that's because I grew up in Texas. I'm a Dallas Cowboy fan. But I don't like the Redskins, and the chop really bothers me.
Yeah.
Atlanta, Georgia is some place that Cherokee people will always be bitter about. If it were the state of Georgia were the people who were so brutal, rapes, lynchings, murders, constant pressure on the tribe. The state of Georgia was the main driving force, together with Andrew Jackson, that led to our forcible removal from our homeland and the loss of so many lives. 4,000 people died on the Trail of Tears. My great-great-grandmother died on the trail. She's buried.
The trail goes right through my wife's hometown, Hopkinsville, Kentucky.
Hopkinsville, Kentucky.
Yeah. Well, I was wondering if you could do a story for us. Show us a little bit about the Native American.
Let me tell you a traditional Cherokee story. I just found this story and I love it. I wish I had known it when I was a child. It's for all the descendants of John Ross Pyburn, who is my father. It's called The Bird That Was Ashamed of His Feet. There was a bird in the beginning days of the world when all creatures spoke the same language. There was a bird who was ashamed of his feet. His feet were huge. Every time he looked down, when he saw how big his feet were compared to his body, he was convinced that Creator had made a terrible mistake, or worse, played a terrible joke on him. And so he wouldn't fly with the other birds. He hid in the tall grass. And Grasshopper was making his way through the grass and bumped into the bird. And he said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "Birds don't hide in the grass. You're a bird. You go sing. You go fly." And Meadowlark said that he wasn't coming out where anyone could see him. And Grasshopper asked him why, and Meadowlark said, "These feet." He said, "If anybody sees my feet, they will laugh at me." And Grasshopper said, "Creator made your feet." He said, "Creator doesn't make mistakes. If your feet are big, there's a reason. And big feet won't stop you from flying, and big feet have nothing to do with how well you sing. You are a bird. You should fly, and you should sing." Well, Grasshopper went on about his business, and Meadowlark sat and thought about the things that Grasshopper had said, and after a while he decided maybe Grasshopper was right, that big feet wouldn't make any difference to how he flew, and they certainly wouldn't make any difference as to how he could sing. So he flew, and he flew into the trees with the other birds, and he landed and he began to sing. And Meadowlark could really sing. All around him, the other birds in the trees grew silent as they listened to his song, and they began to gather in the leaves around the tree where Meadowlark was singing, listening to his beautiful song. But when Meadowlark looked up and saw all the other birds looking at him, the first thing he thought of was they were looking at his feet. They would begin laughing at him, and so he flew away from all the other birds as fast as he could go, and he went back into the tall grass, and he would not come out. Now, there was a quail who had made a nest and laid her eggs in the middle of a wheat field. And one day she heard some men talking about how the wheat was ripe, and they were going to come the next afternoon and cut it. And the quail knew that her eggs were a long way from being ready to hatch, and she began to cry because she knew that when the men walked through the wheat field cutting the wheat, they would not pay attention to where they were going, and her family would be trampled. And as she was crying, Grasshopper heard her crying. And he came and he asked her what was the matter, and she said, "The men are coming to cut the wheat, and my babies will die." Well, Grasshopper thought. He said, "I know a bird. He hides in the tall grass, and he has very big feet. Maybe he can help you." So Quail went and found Meadowlark, and she poured out her story. And Meadowlark thought, well, maybe there's a way I can help. So he went back to the wheat field with Quail. And you know, those big feet were just the right size for picking up Quail's eggs. And one at a time, he picked up Quail's eggs, and he flew with them to the tall grass. And when he had lifted all of the eggs and put them in the tall grass away from the wheat field, Quail made a new nest. And you know, it was a few weeks later that all those eggs hatched. And from that time on, when Meadowlark saw Quail and all those beautiful little babies following her as they went through the tall grass, he thought, you know, these feet did a good thing. They saved those babies' lives. Maybe they're not a mistake. And Meadowlark flew out of the tall grass and flew with the other birds and landed in the trees and began to sing. And do you know that he has been singing from that day to this?
Oh, that's a great story. Yeah,
I wish I'd known it. When I was a kid, I had these huge feet. I don't know if you can see them or not, but my dad wears a size 14 and my mother wears a size 11, so it was not like I had a lot of choice. You know, but
Well, I know what he feels like. These are 14s.
yeah,
so.
yeah, you know, it's like, I would have loved to have known that story when I was a kid.
I used to just buy the boxes when I was a kid. They only charged me 50
Yeah,
cents because
just
they
tie
were
'em
big
on,
enough.
tie 'em
Tie 'em
on
up,
with the
tie 'em up,
shoelaces,
boxes,
yeah.
My father always used to say, well, do they come with oars or with an outboard motor? Because called them boats.
Well, it's just those of us with big feet, we know what we live with. They charge us $50 more a centimeter for the extra leather that it takes if you have to buy your shoes at the Bigfoot store.
Now, you and I were talking recently when I was doing a column on Native American stories, on personal stories, and we were talking about being that cultural ambassador and how important it is for people to realize that the Native American culture is very different from the European culture. And you said something that still sticks with me about how Native Americans couldn't understand the Europeans for leaving their homes.
Well, I just thought it was a basic clash that European people couldn't understand why Indian people were so reluctant to leave their homes. You know, the constantly tribes were being displaced one after another, and one of the rationales that white people would, or European people would use was always, well, we're offering them better land further west. You know, that was something that they could say to salve their conscience, or to say, you know, you often heard, well, this is for the good of the Indian people. They'll be moving further west, and, you know, they can live the way they want to live, away from the way we live. And they didn't understand the sacredness of the land that each tribe held for their homeland, their part of creation. And I just thought it might have something to do with, these were generations of people who voluntarily uprooted themselves and their families from land and traditions that had gone back for so long. I mean, this was an incredible undertaking in those days, to travel to the New World. It was risky, it was, you know, could be life-threatening, no assurance of success here in the New World, you know, lots of opportunities, but you know, I was wondering, just speculating aloud really about that kind of, those two different mindsets. You know, that was kind of a built-in clash right there at the very beginning, because one piece of land was the same as any other.
That's
you
right.
know, if we take 40 acres here, we'll give you 400 there. Anybody can see that that's a better deal. You know, well, when you're talking about this 40 acres where your ancestors have been born, lived, and died, and been buried, going back through countless generations, when all your stories are about these creatures that live on this land. This rock has a story. That cliff, we know a story where that came from. I mean, everything about an Indian culture would be completely intertwined and enmeshed with the land those people lived on. So it was a terrible thing to ask, and it was a terrible thing to force on people. You know, when in 1989, I was invited to participate in the tribe's 150th anniversary, a 3-day commemoration of the end of the trail. The Cherokees left on the Trail of Tears in October of 1838, and by March of 1839, those who had survived were in what is now Oklahoma and Arkansas. And at the national capital there in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, there was a 3-day event commemorating the end of the trail. And throughout the weekend, with the speeches and all the different events that were held, and the programs that were held at the library, even though there was a spirit of hope and a spirit of survival, we are, you know, our culture is alive, our language is alive, our dances, our stories. We as a nation, we are alive. The overwhelming sadness, 150 years later, in the stories of each of our ancestors who came across on that trail, it's as though it happened yesterday. I thought maybe I was like different in that, because that's the way it was when my grandmother told me about it. And I can, you know, you can get me started on the trail and wake up 4 days later and I'm still going. And I thought maybe it was just something peculiar to our family because of Chief Ross being so important to the whole story, but it was true for everybody I met and everybody I worked with that entire weekend. Their family stories and their family's experiences on the trail are every bit as vivid to people my age.
Do you find that the Native American, that we're having a less of what I feel is a glamorization of the Native American, and people are more realizing the wealth and depths of the culture and saying
I hope so.
And more interested in the culture itself?
In a real way,
in a real way rather than the Hollywood way?
Rather than exploiting
Right.
it. I hope so. I can only hope. The tribes are all so different. The cultures, the languages, the stories, we are all so very different. Yet, at the same time, there is very definitely what I consider to be an intertribal Indian culture that also exists. Because, I mean, if there's a silver lining to the way this society works now, we now have access to one another and a commonality of experience that goes far beyond anything we had ever experienced before, although the trading networks across this continent were vast before European contact. But I hope that people are interested in learning more about the things that we are anxious to share, and I hope that they will respect our feelings about those things that we are not. I get very disturbed by cultural appropriation, cultural exploitation. The New Age Indian medicine man phenomenon, rip-offs with regard to our arts and crafts and things like that. And it's a very complex and complicated issue that you can go on about for hours, but I really hope that people will understand where we open the doors and welcome exchanges, and where things that are sacred are meant to be kept secret, because that's how their power, that's where the power comes from.
Could you do us a little story?
Sure,
Yeah, go ahead.
sure. Oh, let me tell you one about Rabbit.
Okay.
This is going to be in my book,
Oh, good.
the
good.
mythical book that will someday appear. Actually, it's now scheduled for March '94. Harper
Good.
takes a long time. This is a story about Rabbit. You know, we tell a lot of stories about Rabbit. You knew that Rabbit was always jealous of Otter, right? You've heard me tell the
Yes.
story about how Rabbit tried to steal Otter's beautiful coat because he was jealous of that. Well, after he lost his tail, Bear jerked his tail off for that little routine, Rabbit just got worse and worse. Every time Otter did anything, Rabbit would be right there saying, well, I can do that. Well, in fact, I can do that better than you can do that, you know. There wasn't anything that Otter could do that Rabbit didn't feel like he could do better. And one time Otter said, well, you know, I eat fish a lot. You know, I swim really well. I can dive under the water, I can catch fish. I've never seen you do that. Oh, I eat fish all the time. It's one of my favorites. I'll show you. So Rabbit goes down to the river. Otter, everybody's following along behind him. Rabbit dives underwater, swims all the way to the bottom, and grabs onto the reeds that are growing on the bottom of the river and starts gulping mud. River water. Comes back up, burping, you know, and his belly's all swollen like this, and boy, his breath was so bad, people thought he really had been eating fish. So well, maybe Rabbit's right. Maybe he can do anything Otter can do. Well, that made Otter mad. So the next time he ran into Rabbit, he said, well, I eat ducks. I eat ducks a lot. I can swim underwater and I can catch a duck. I've never seen you do that. Oh, I eat ducks all the time, said Rabbit. I love ducks. Well, let's go have some for lunch then, said Otter, and you can show me how you hunt ducks. Well, they went down to the river, and Rabbit said, well, since this is where you live, and manners being what they are, I should let you go first. So Otter takes a deep breath and swims under the river to where the ducks are and reaches up, grabs one by the legs, and pops him down underneath the water before any of the other ducks even know what happened. Swims back to the bank. Now, while Otter was gone, Rabbit was busy pulling those river reeds and braiding them until he had made a rope. So he looped that rope around his shoulder. He says, now you watch how I hunt ducks. And he dives underwater. Of course, you know, Rabbit, he's a terrible swimmer. You know, he doesn't go 2 yards. He's up to the top. He's got to breathe, and he under and up, and Otter's laughing because he knows if Rabbit keeps doing that, the ducks will see him coming and fly away. But Rabbit finally gets a deep enough breath so that he can go all the way under. And he comes up among the ducks, and he takes that braided rope, and he throws the noose around the duck's neck and yanks as hard as he can. And that duck starts squawking and flapping his wings and throwing himself. He's beating Rabbit, just throwing Rabbit from side to side in the water. Rabbit was so senseless, all he knew was hold on to that rope. And about that time, the duck got tired of the whole situation and just started flapping his wings and lifted off from the surface of the river and took Rabbit right on up into the sky with him. Otter's just sitting there watching Rabbit fly away. Rabbit looks down and says, before I eat a duck, I usually fly with him a ways. You know, and off they went, out of sight. Well, the duck that Rabbit had chosen was a very strong flyer. And he went on and on with no signs of landing, and finally Rabbit just had to let go of the rope and fall. And he fell and he landed right in the middle of a hollow tree stump that was sticking up, and there was no hole at the bottom. Rabbit was stuck there. And as time went by, Rabbit got to be very hungry. And pretty soon he was starving. He began nibbling on his fur. And that's what rabbits do to this day when they get very hungry. But finally he heard some children playing nearby, and he started singing to them. He said, "Cut a hole in the base of this tree. Cut a hole and look at me. I'm the prettiest thing you ever did see." The kids gathered around. They listened to that tree stump singing. They went home and got their father, and he came and he listened to Rabbit's song, and he started chopping a hole in the base of that tree. And when it was big enough, Rabbit said, "Now stand back so you can get a good look at me." And when all of the people had moved away, Rabbit dove out of that hole and raced away as fast as he could. But you know, he's still just as big a boaster as he ever was.
Oh, that's wonderful. Wonderful story. It's wonderful to see the trickster stories in just about every culture. I just learned a trickster story from Cameroon, where Turtle is a trickster.
Oh, is he? Yeah. Turtle's a pretty good trickster in Cherokee. Not near like Rabbit, but Turtle holds his own in lots of situations.
That's
with
great.
Rabbit.
Yeah. It's wonderful.
In fact, Turtle is one of the few people who ever puts one over on Rabbit. You know.
Well, I like the idea of a turtle. Something that moves nice and slow. I just love turtles.
About it. Well, our version of the turtle and the rabbit racing is this moralizing, you know, slow and steady wins the race, and, you know, that doesn't cut it. What Turtle does is he goes and he gets all his relatives. And he stations them, they're supposed to race over 4 mountain ridges, and Turtle stations a turtle relative at the top of each ridge, and he crosses the finish line so that he can talk with everybody.
That's great.
But,
I've heard that story.
He tricks Rabbit. You know, he beats Rabbit by coming up with an even better trick.
Oh, well, thank you, Gayle. You've been great today. I want to thank Gayle Ross for coming over here on the Grapevine Harvest. And I want to thank all of you for tuning us in. And remember that the Prairie Grapevine Folklore Society sponsors concerts at the Lincoln Land Community College on the first Saturday of the month, and special concerts throughout the area. So come on out some Saturday and check out the storytellers and check out the folk singers and songwriters. And also bring your guitar and bring your stories to the open mics. We really need to have our community sharing their stories and their songs. Until then, keep your stories alive. I'm Dan Ketting, and thanks to Gayle Ross for coming here today.
2 million Illinois adults have trouble reading. Judy was one of them.
Life was like a jail because I couldn't.
To and fro daily in his holy church. Amen. I thank the Lord for the last poem. I can do it. And we got some people in our churches and look like they're just masters of all trades. Anything you name, they feel as if they can do it. That's not being reasonable. We know God gave us multiple talents, but he doesn't give all of the talents to one person. So we need to keep that in mind. And we see a person of that nature, we need to let them know, hey, this is not the right spirit. So I thank the Lord for the program today. Hopefully you've understood that there are idol gods existing in our land today. Face it, they're real. They're for real, and they're sitting right in your church today. Ask God to give you grace and revelation of these individuals and the manner in which they come forth, and pray with me that God will utterly destroy them